which is here, but it emphasizes it or perhaps exaggerates it, and therefore makes us put people together in groups which they ought not to be in. I have more in common with a black scholar than I have with a white man who's against scholarship. And you have more in common with a white author than you have with someone who's against all literature. So why must we always concentrate on color or on religion or this? There are other ways of connecting men.
I'll tell you this. When I left this country in 1948, I left this country for one reason only, one reason. I didn't care where I went. I might have gone to Hong Kong, I might have gone to Timbuktu, I ended up in Paris, on the streets of Paris, with $40 in my pocket on the theory that nothing worse could happen to me there than had already happened to me here. You talk about making it as a writer by yourself. You have to be able then to turn off all the antenna with which you live, because once you turn your back on this society, you may die. You may die. And it's very hard to sit at a typewriter and concentrate on that if you're afraid of the world around you. The years I lived in Paris did one thing for me. They released me from that particular social terror, which was not the paranoia of my own mind, but a real social danger visible in the face of every cop, every boss, everybody. I don't know what most white people in this country feel, but I can only include what they feel from the state of their institutions. I don't know if white Christians hate Negroes or not, but I know that we have a Christian church which is white and a Christian church which is black. I know, as Malcolm X once put it, that the most segregated hour in American life is high noon on Sunday. That says a great deal for me about a Christian nation. It means that I can't afford to trust most white Christians, and certainly cannot trust the Christian church. I don't know whether the labor unions and their bosses really hate me. That doesn't matter, but I know I'm not in their unions. I don't know if the real estate lobby is anything against black people, but I know the real estate lobbies keep me in the ghetto. I don't know if the Board of Education hates black people, but I know the textbooks that give my children to read and the schools that we have to go to. Now, this is the evidence. You want me to make an act of faith, risking myself, my wife, my woman, my sister, my children, on some idealism which you assure me exists in America, which I have never seen.
Yes, yes, yes. What is up? What is up, everyone? First episode of the General Strike podcast. I'm Matt, the Hipster Hunter. Should be an interesting show today because I believe there's a lot to get to, and plus it's the first show of a podcast. So we're, introduction should be in order and stuff like that. A lot on this show. And like the start of the show, we have to remember James Baldwin, who it's his birthday today. We have to remember the great, the legend that he is. I think it would have been 96, or 98. I forget exactly how old he would have been today. But rest in peace, rest in power to the legend himself. Without further ado, let me get to my co-host, Mr. Fugate in Dallas. Fu, how are you, man?
Doing great, Matt. Man, I love that clip. I shared that on my Instagram. I went through and really tried to highlight some of the black leaders that we're really not taught about, that were really kind of monumental in the civil rights era. And Baldwin was one of them. And what he says there is absolutely true. For him to be a successful writer, not only did he have to be good, he had to be able to put aside any fear that he had for speaking truth to power, because at any moment you could be killed. So that's such a great clip. He has another one later on where he says, that if white people were willing, or establishment powers were willing to allow black people to be as, revolutionary as white people, then a lot of their leaders would have been heroes to us, right? And that Malcolm X would maybe still be alive, because throughout the world, we've allowed all of these people, Israelis, Russians, whatever, everyone is allowed to fight for their freedom. But when it comes to black people in the U.S., like when they say, give me liberty or give me death, we have evolved policing and all these other things to shut that rhetoric down and to stop, since 400 years, of just terror. So
no, I absolutely agree. We're going to play that clip later on the show, by the way. I know you.
Oh, nice.
I didn't want to jump in because, you were going on a good one. But yes, we're going to play that clip later on the show. We're going to save a bunch of the clips of James Baldwin for the end of the show as a remembrance of him. And that is one of them. But we have a lot to get to, and sort of introductions are in order, Fu, because even though we're used to doing podcasts to a degree and we're used to having an audience that knows who we are to a degree, this is a completely new venture for us. We don't do political podcasts, we do sports podcasts. So I think it, again, a little bit of an introduction is in order for maybe new listeners or new watchers that find us and want to figure out what this show is. So Fu, I'm going to ask questions to you and then answer them myself after you, make you go on the hot seat first. If you can briefly describe your political ideology, what would it be?
I've said this to you before, and I think that we've had some disagreements about it, but I'm a libertarian leftist. I believe that the state of a person is to be kind of independent of any government, other than the need for not of borders if you're completely handicapped, then maybe not maybe, absolutely you would have assistance from the state and things like that, right? And that I'm not opposed to things like UBI or anything like that, but I'm much more an advocate for strong worker rights. I am much more an advocate for pay that makes sense. I would love for someone like my mom, right, who was a single mother of 4 at 20 years old, 21 years old. I would have loved for her to be able to be on government assistance while working her way up somewhere to where it would make sense for her to disconnect from public benefits, right? Where instead we built a model where if you have 4 kids, it's really hard to choose. You choose one or the other, really. You either live miserably on government assistance or miserably on minimum wage, $18,000 a year. And once you take healthcare and everything out, you have nothing left, So to me, I think the government's role is to ensure that the individual citizen is held above everything, corporations, all of that, worker rights, the individual liberties, that's where I'm more rooted, right? And maybe that's more of a Texan side of me, because I never got the conservative side of it, but the individual I did. I do fiercely believe in individual rights above all things. That's why I've always been massively in support of equality for Black people, gay rights, everything. Because to me, there's no one that should tell you what you can do in the privacy of your own house or even publicly as a citizen most of the time, unless you're infringing directly on somebody else's rights,
I don't disagree with most of what you say, Phil. I wonder where you think we disagree on, honestly.
Well, you said libertarian in the U.S. has a different connotation, and that's true, but I'm going from the roots, the 1800s, with the French revolutions. And
obviously, tangent off rip, but this is going to be one of those shows where we're going on a lot of tangents. That's why we only have just a few topics, because I expect a lot of tangents. But the idea or the identifying term of libertarian socialists or libertarian leftists. I'm going to say libertarian socialists for this conversation because I've seen that more often. I think in the modern U.S. political sense, it's a little bit of a oxymoron to say that. I understand if you are combining, let's say, the individual liberty rights in that philosophy of libertarianism and trying to combine that with a socialist ideology. I understand that. It's combining, in a way, weird comparison maybe, but humanism with Christianity, because you have Christian humanists, right? You get that to a degree. I just think, again, and this is where we're going to maybe run into a little bit more of a debate here, or overall as the show progresses, not only for this episode, but in later episodes. I agree with you in principle that you're right. There's such thing as libertarian socialism. To argue against that would be a little bit insane, just stupid, because there is a long history of it to a degree, right? So I get it, but there is an element of strategy that we have to implement as the left that I think sort of trying to co-opt that term is a futile effort, in my opinion. Not that we can't bring solidarity with libertarians on certain issues, because we definitely can, right? For example, Gary, who Gary from Dallas, our co-host on Mixed Combat Radio, was going to be on the show. He couldn't. He's a libertarian. Like we would argue he's more of just a pure libertarian in the sense, and take up maybe the socialist or leftist side of your aspect to it. And I think we agree on certain issues, some key issues as well.
Oh yeah, defund the police, abuse of corporate power, all that stuff. I think Gary's almost right in line with.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
it's funny because this is again a wider, more macro topic to get into, maybe again in a longer series of episodes and stuff. But the idea of the Workers' Party, right, and the idea of bringing together a mass sort of coalition, right, of political parties in this moment. There is a lot of, I think, good debate, a lot of good discourse around the positives of that from a strategy perspective. But there's also, from a historical perspective, a lot of discourse about how there's negatives about that, how that co-opting more centrist or right-wing perspectives or groups of people actually hurts the movement long term, because it makes the movement in terms of goals and perspectives a little more off and a little more skewed. But again, that's maybe beside the point here. If I had to describe my brief political ideology, because I'm not going to get too in depth as you did, because you went to really certain policy sets. I'm not going to get too far into that. I would plainly just define myself as either a Marxist or a socialist, just simply as that. Usually I just use whichever one depending on the strategy of the conversation, right? And that's, again, how I frame a lot of this conversation or political conversations is strategy. When you're talking to someone, when you're having discourse with someone, do you want to piss them off when they're just a right-wing nut job? I'm going to say I'm a Marxist. If I'm trying to, if I'm trying to sort of coax a potential leftist, right? Somebody that is on the fringe, but could be, I'm going to use the word socialist more often than Marxist, because Marxist might scare them, right? But Marxism is a socialist ideology, and I would have to define myself probably more as a Marxist, because my understanding and my sense of capitalism is rooted so much into Marx, Engels, or even Katowski and others that came on the later generation. A lot of them influence in terms of my perception of capitalism and the evils of it. And when you get to maybe pre-Marxist socialism, that wasn't as a prevalent issue, and it was far more of a utopian aspect or philosophy. And I just think that utopianism is ridiculous. It's all about systems and institutions, and if the institutions are messed up, if the systems are messed up, like capitalism is by default, because capitalism is built on exploitation of people, then you're only going to get sort of the death and destruction of the lower class, as we've seen from basically the enclosures of the commons and the farmland of the 17th century, or no, 15th century England onwards. So, and then when we look at, let's say, into it a modern sense and sort of my political philosophy, the solution is where I think we might have a little bit of a discussion, more of a debate, what these new systems should look like. When you talk about wanting a let's say single mother with 4 kids, right, to be able to work a full-time job and be on government assistance, I get that to a degree, but I think the inherent need for a job, for capitalism, for a wage labor, that needs to be done with long term. And again, long term speaking, we're going to discuss that more and more as the show progresses.
No, I get that. I absolutely believe that attaching human value to a job is an issue with our society, right? Because then that's why you have so many people that are maybe stay-at-home dads or moms that are completely I don't think it's a massive issue, but I think that there is an issue when you're a stay-at-home person and you don't feel like you're contributing monetarily to the family, even though you are absolutely fulfilling one of the greatest needs our society has, raising individuals that will be like beneficial to other human beings, there's a depression that comes along with that, because you don't see value because of how we determine value in our society. So I absolutely agree.
And we determine value often by like social constructs, right? Like when you're growing up in school, it's like a friend group, or it's a school group, or your school versus that school. It's the social constructs and groups that we create. And it's the same with work, right? Like you identify yourself with your work.
Yep.
I mean, you're wearing your work shirt, like people wear like their work attire, like people identify themselves as their job.
I don't work here anymore. This is just a comfy shirt.
Okay.
But I'm not good at mirrors either.
But you did though, right? Like you that thing about like it is so ingrained in our society that like having merch of your job is like the normal thing, even though most massive corporations are exploiting your labor.
Well, and people from my generation, that's how you were raised. Like you were raised to see value in, like, if you were putting food on the table, like if you're a man, like, it's very new. I bring this up all the time that we live in a great time to be a father, because I can hug my son. I can give my son a kiss. I can tell him he's handsome. I can, really invest emotionally in my son as a man.
Positively too.
Whereas like my father would never have done that, because he would have been raising a sensitive male, and sensitive males didn't make it. Like you needed to be tough. You needed to work. You needed to put food on the table. You were the disciplinarian of the family. Like the wife was a support role. Like, we're outside of that scope now, but I still have where I was kind of on the fringe of those breaks, right? Of a lot of the change and shift in culture. And, so to me, I do still find a lot of value in how good I do at my job and how big my paycheck is. Whereas you may be detached from that a little bit, because you are, about 15 years younger than me, 14 years younger than me, right? 10. Are you 25?
You're like 40 now, huh? So yeah,
I'm 39. So
15.
Yeah. So
man,
I'm on the bubble of the generations that are going to be probably the greatest generations, right? So, when you look at like human equality and things like that, like even younger Republicans are not going to be worried as much about gay rights or things like that. They're going to be like, let people get married. It's, that's not our role, and so not all, of course, there are still going to be some very fucked up young Republicans, but.
And to be fair, that is still a very, very new sort of system and paradigm we're under, right? Like Obama didn't run on legalizing gay marriage, right? Like that was an issue. Remember in 2008, like Obama was not for gay marriage at the time, and that was a big part of the discourse. 12 years ago now, or 13 years ago, because there's they campaigned in 2007. So even within my recent lifetime, like the discussion on gay marriage has been one that we just sort of, in theory, won, right? But then we have concerns about the judicial system and the way the Republicans have been stacking the Supreme Court and just overall courts and the judicial system, and the concerns on Roe versus Wade and other sort of laws and legislations when it comes to women's rights, when it comes to gay rights, when it comes to just human rights in general. So I do, it's one of those things where, yes, we have won certain key battles in the last decade or so, but those battles, as we've seen, could quickly get undone, right? That is not outside the realm of possibility here. That was the big concern about Brett Kavanaugh, right? Other than him being a rapist, was his views on abortion, his views on women's rights, which is probably indicative of him being a rapist, alleged rapist. And I wonder, let's say 5 years from now, what's this discourse going to be like? Because we've gained as a movement, as the leftist movement, we have gained so much ground just in the last 5 years, right? Since the sort of the Bernie campaign, and that being such a meteoric rise for leftist philosophy again. Probably the most we've seen since the revolutionary time of the 60s and 70s of James Baldwin era, right? Like it's the most we've talked about in terms of revolutionary thought and philosophy since then. And that's in large part just in the last 5 years due to Bernie Sanders' campaign and that it becoming more mainstream. But unfortunately, we've seen, and we're going to talk about this maybe later on or maybe soon. Actually, maybe this is a good time to bring in this topic. The idea of combating liberals, right? Like we as leftists, even though we have to fight the right all the time, we have to fight fascism all the time, we have to fight battles with liberals probably more often.
Liberals are more, I think, nefarious to a degree because what liberals want in general is just for things to go back to normal. Or like you hear a lot of people say, I just want to elect someone that I don't have to talk about every day, right? Because they just don't really like talking about Trump, because they just don't like talking about the presidency, and they just really want to go to work and make good money and come home and forget that there's all these things wrong with the world.
Mm-hmm.
And that to me is a larger problem than even talking to people who maybe agree that there's stuff wrong in the US, but that we just have differences of opinion about what is wrong in the US, right? Like liberals more like, hey, it's a great country. You have so many, like they'll tell you all the time, like if you think it's bad, like try living somewhere else, or you'll bring up poverty and they'll go, well, there's people in Bangladesh or, you know, make way less. It's like, yeah, but you can't say those things because it's like poverty in Bangladesh and poverty in the US are two completely different things because standards of living in Bangladesh are different than standards of living in the US. And like, we should be, of course, as like, you know, from Michael and everyone, like being absolutely like great internationalists, right? We should care about the Bangladeshi people and their plight and how we've abused labor sources around the world. But we still have to admit that poverty in the US it isn't great. Like that's like a liberal thing, is that, well, it's not that bad because you still have an iPhone and you have a TV and you have Netflix and a PS4. Poverty still sucks. When you grow up poor, it's shit, you know? So,
I mean,
oh yeah,
it's just been almost 30 million people in the U.S. didn't have enough to eat last week. As we know, 40 plus Americans have lost their job within the last 6 months or so of the pandemic. Also want to add this picture to the mix. American billionaires have made an average of $42 billion a week throughout the pandemic. And, you know, since we're talking about fighting liberals, I want to bring up this very quickly, the idea of us fighting the Democratic platform right now and the DNC, especially with Joe Biden. Oh, my God. And Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi. Oh, my God. All of them motherfuckers. Tom Perez, that slimy motherfucker. And we have 700 Democrat delegates sign that they will oppose a platform, the Democrat platform, that fails to renew the party's commitment to establish a national health care system. As we know, a majority of Americans, I think it was 60, well, let me find the percentage. It was like 60-something percent.
5 or 8%, something like that.
I'll find it. Hold on. Eventually I'll find it. But digressing back to the point, you know, I'll shoot over to you, Fu. If in this sort of climate right now where we see such income disparity or income inequality, we see such a divide between the American public, it seems, and the American establishment on things like healthcare. How is this movement, the leftist movement, not winning more battles?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, they've had you know, plenty of studies of how like public opinion being extremely high on multiple different topics, right? But legislation never matching it, right? And legislation almost always aligns with where the money is. So money is in lobbying, right? So money is in lobbying for health insurers, from health insurers, lobbying from the medical industry, lobbying from, all of that shit. So you could have 80% of the population that wants a public option or a Medicare for all and to abolish completely private insurers, but you're never going to get the legislation because of the money that's poured into the system.
No,
And that's where I think that breakdown comes in. And the left loses because of the fact that we have and I know this is not a popular opinion for a lot of people, but I don't really give a shit what's popular. I'm going to tell you how I feel. The Democrats are terrible. And aligning ourselves with Democrats for as long as we have, like if you look back historically, there's been no break from the Democratic Party, even though the Democratic Party has never carried the torch for like leftist policies.
the closest would be FDR's New Deal policy.
Exactly. And even when you look at like, you look at going into, for instance, like JFK, which is everyone's hero. Look, JFK, great at speeches. Like, I mean, I listened to him give a speech, and seriously, like, it's rousing. Like, you want to really cheer him on. And he said some great things, but then in practice, did not do any of those great things.
And on top of it, I forget the exact statistic, but he grossly expanded the CIA operation across the world. I mean, obviously, he was involved with regime change in Cuba, and it failed. He was obviously involved in Central and South America as well. I mean,
heavily involved in Vietnam way before the Vietnam war part of the war started, but trying his best to supplant leadership there.
The comparisons of him and Obama are very apt for a lot of reasons, and it's a lot of bad reasons too.
For other reasons too. I mean, if you look at Obama siding and picking Biden, it was very similar to JFK picking
Lyndon B. Johnson.
Lyndon B. Johnson, and Johnson was a massive racist. Johnson was his best friend was one of the top racist separatists. He wanted he was a separate but equal guy, the dude that he was best friends with, and he was a Republican, and that was Johnson's best friend. And so I'm not saying you can't be friends with people who view things differently than you, but I would be really hard pressed to have a best friend that saw another human being as less than themselves or myself. I couldn't be really good friends with a white person that was a racist. I just couldn't. I could be a colleague at work and say hi and bye, and I would be polite because we're at work, but I would never consider myself a best friend and travel with them like Johnson did with this other guy all the time, So, I mean, there's a lot there to unpack. So my point being that we've got to separate ourselves from Democrats. If we want wins, it's going to come in the form of really just fucking driving a sledgehammer into that voter base, right? Because that's the only way. It's either going to do one of two things. It'll drive the Democrats to even be more of a center-right party, which they already really are. Let's face it. They're not a leftist party at all. They rarely ever bring up anything leftist. And even when it's women's rights, it's only when it's expedient, politically expedient. If it's gay rights, it's politically expedient. It's never something they actually believe in, right? Because if they really believed in women's rights, Biden wouldn't be the candidate. He has too much going against him on the female side of his abuses of power when it comes to young interns and things like that. You wouldn't put that guy.
Tara Reid,
exactly.
For example, yeah.
So it's all lip service.
Connecting to that, I mentioned earlier about who do we have a coalition with, right? In terms of strategy, right? I'm always thinking about strategy when it comes to politics, because our end goal is ending capitalism, and upending the political order that we know it and creating a new one. It just has to. Whether it's still a federal system, I think that maybe it's up for debate, and that's maybe a topic for another show. But when we talk about getting to that end point, liberals aren't going to help us get there. I would argue that most libertarians in the U.S. sense of it will not support us long term with that issue. They might support us with one issue and maybe defund the police, or they may be a little bit wary of like NSA and in the overall intelligence community. But that's it. When it comes to economic issues, we still come to a huge crossroads when it comes to most other, for lack of a better term, mainstream political movements in the U.S. when it comes to liberals, libertarians, conservatives, and then leftists, let's say, right? Leftists are the minority of the bunch. And to be in coalition with the other three, I think, would disservice us long term. You know, when we talk about creating a new political party, for example, right? I know you sort of wanted to dive into that. And that's sort of where you were going with your point. You know, I think the Green Party is a joke, to be honest, because they don't ever worry about local elections. They only worry about the presidential election. They never worry about local issues. DSA isn't a political party. So we would have to, in theory, create a new political party to fight both Democrats and Republicans, both parties in bed with major corporations. I think that is such an uphill battle. I think before we even get to that, we have to first deal with the capitalism or the capitalistic issue within our society. And that goes both from a public perspective of just me and you and how capitalism affects me and you, and both from a political perspective and how capitalism affects our politics, and how rooted big corporations are when it comes to the lobbyists, when it comes to anything under like Citizens United. This is clearly, when it comes to a chicken or egg issue, capitalism is the genesis of a lot of our issues. When it comes to not only within the U.S. but overall Western civilization and how it then colonized most of the world. So the world's issue, right, is capitalism. So am I wrong in saying, Fu, that before we even get to those battles of changing or adding a new political party and fighting the Democrats or Republicans, we have to first deal with capitalism? And we might not even end up dealing with that issue by the end of it when we get through with capitalism. Because, when we talk about reform or revolution, that's a topic I want to get to overall throughout this show and throughout this podcast series, so to speak, is that should we go through the reform route? Should we, have a political party, create a new one that fights the Democrats and Republicans and go through it that way? Or should we have, for lack of a better term, a revolution, a political revolution, let's say, nonviolent, air quotes, political revolution, and change the whole order and also the economic order that we have? Because the economic order is what leads to everything that we have. When we talk about, when you mention the person that just wants to work and not worry about politics, that's because they have to work. If they don't work, they die, right? Like they get pushed out by the system and crushed by it. So if that system wasn't there, that crushing exploitative system, then people could care about politics. People could become more informed. Let alone actually dealing with the political party issue that we have in terms of Republicans versus Democrats and how both parties are corporatist parties that are adherent to all major corporations. Just depends which one.
Yeah, no, I mean, we've definitely seen that aspect with COVID-19 because people are out of work right now. They're maybe working from home or getting paid to stay home right now and kind of like this odd place. So you see them in the streets. A lot of white people that maybe were not as solidly on, the fuck the police train, right, are out in the streets right now. And the reason being is they have the time. So they have the time to watch the videos. They have the time to listen to friends. They have the time to go out and talk to some people. And a lot of people got upset. And we've been upset, a lot of us on the left. That's the thing. I feel like if you're a real leftist, you've been worried about all this stuff for quite some time, and you've been talking about it, and you were ignored. And like, I tell my wife this all the time because she's gotten more aggressive lately with like Black Lives Matter and stuff, and she's like really gotten involved and gets almost to the point, like the other day she was like, we could move out of Texas, it's perfectly fine, because she doesn't want to be in an area that is so blinded to these things, right?
I bet you're
where we live is completely different. It's not a city. Like, we live in a small town nearly in Oklahoma, and it is very racist, very much, capitalistic. I've always been on the outs, right? In 6th grade I read Capital, and like, I was from that point, right? From that point, really outside of everyone on like the way I thought, because I stopped being religious at 8 years old. I knew like I didn't find any meaning in that, and so I've always been kind of outside of the norm here. But I would be on these rants, and she would just be looking at me like, you're fucking crazy, like, just chill, it's not that bad. But now she's like, oh shit, it's that bad. Like, and so I think leftists are always a little ahead of the curve on, like, for instance, 9/11, right? Huh?
We're always ahead on the curve. Like, this is an issue. Like,
yeah,
like we've been saying that for
the Patriot Act. Every leftist was like, holy shit, this is terrible. Like, what are we doing here? Like, we're one thing I want to bring up was a stat on policing. Like, policing has grown since 1977 by 300%. Like, so the federal budget went from 0.05% of the GDP to almost a 0.25% of the GDP in 30 years, 40 years now, right? So it's like, we've done that because, and then we've instituted these policies where the FBI was going in and not just finding radicalized Muslims, but talking to Muslims who were maybe just a little bit worried about the way the conversation was going in the U.S. and painting every Muslim as a terrorist. And then they were turning those people in to radicalized Muslims by saying, hey, let's bomb this thing, or let's do this. And they'd be like, no. And you'd see all these cases where they got turned down multiple times. And then the FBI got the person to agree to do it and then arrested them and did it as some like major victory for this terrible fucking thing that we instituted in the US, where we've all agreed to have all of our personal information collected and all of our phone calls collected. And like, the left, we've always said, hey, like, I think that's where the libertarian side of it, or the side that is like fearful of government, like more of a Bakunin stance and less of a Marxist. Like, Marx, I think, heavily believed that you could have like really good people assume power and then relinquish that power to the people. And I've always taken the stance that if you give anyone too much power, they won't want to let it go. And that's where my break with Marx really came. And I cared more about Bakunin, right? But
over the dictatorship of the proletariat, like that term.
Yeah, because Marx, even Marx knew that. Like with Russia, like if you listen to anything as Marx said about Russia, he said it was a shit example of like communism, right? Like he never would have picked Russia for that experiment.
They all wanted England, for example.
Right.
They all thought England was going to be the first socialist bastion because the workers in the Industrial Revolution in England were the ones that they deemed so exemplifying capitalism and capitalistic exploitation.
Yeah.
While, let's say, the Tsarist monarchy in Russia, that was still an example of feudalism and not true capitalism. So to convert from feudalism to all the way to a communist state, that was a lot of leaps from a historical perspective that Marx never thought was possible. I do want to get into that term eventually on one show, the dictatorship of the proletariat, and what that would look like, what that would mean, because Marx never defined it. Marx was one knock on him. He did leave a lot of terms for just up for definition and up for personal interpretation, let's say. And that one is a big one because that's how, let's say, Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin sort of abused their powers because they said they were acting on the dictatorship of the proletariat, which Marx said was going to happen once the proletariats overthrew the bourgeoisie class and instituted their new government, that there would be this in-between period, right? This influx, right, between the old order and the new order. And in between that time, you would have this dictatorship of the proletariat. What that would look like, I'm very curious about, but maybe for a different time.
Yeah, no, definitely. We could definitely get in the weeds with all that. But so that's where I think leftists were a lot of the time ahead on things that are going to go sideways, right? And I think that's where liberals are so damning to the left, because a lot of times they give lip service to like what we want, but then when it comes to really pushing it through, they have a different idea of what that picture looks like, right? And so David Harvey gets into this a lot with his like take back the city or right to the city stuff. And he's another Marxist, and he says that like the revolutions work often. The problem is that a lot of times revolutionaries don't know what they want when they win. They don't know what they want it to look like.
I mean, that was an issue with the beginning of Marxism. I mean, capital doesn't provide a solution, right? It's a damning piece of evidence against capitalism, right? Capital is probably the best piece of literature to show someone, to describe the horrors of capitalism, right? But he doesn't really provide a solution to it. And Marx never really did either, like in terms of all of his other work. Engels never did. They were never really concerned with that, from my understanding, from my reading of other people talking about Marx and Engels, that they were so concerned about the then and there, that like the horrors of it, and they thought that this workers' revolution was going to come any point in time, so they just wanted to keep banging that drum, and it never came, right? And they all end up just dying off of old age. I wonder if how much of an issue that is, and from a, again, strategy perspective, and from our rhetoric, from the leftist rhetoric, because we all, in terms of pointing at the faults in the system, I think we do the best job at it, and that's why the movement has been gaining the momentum that we had gained in the last 5 years, right? But we didn't win this last cycle in the presidential election, let's say, with Bernie Sanders as a democratic socialist. For lack of a better term, he's a socialist, right?
Yeah.
In the American perspective. I think that is in large part due to not offering enough solutions. Not that we don't offer solutions. For example, Medicare for All is a great solution. Green New Deal, I think it's a great socialist policy set that we can implement. There are things that we, in terms of the leftist movement, have put forward as solutions. But in terms of explaining what this new order would look like, we do a very bad job of it. And even I'm trying to read up more on how to better explain that to people, because I don't do a good job of it.
We also do a shitty job at like celebrating wins, right? Like,
oh yeah,
Obama was like, when he had some really good victories, he didn't do a good job of articulating those victories. So a lot of people could say like, well, what did Obama really change? Right? And for all intents and purposes, like Obama was much better than say Trump or Bush, right?
Or Clinton, for example, like
Clinton,
there's no
right?
In Obama's presidency.
So, I mean, when you look at it, like, would Biden be better than Trump? Absolutely, right? I'm not a leftist that's going to say
they're equal,
that they're the same, because they are far from the same. Let me tell you, when unlabeled fucking private company, like military people, are on the streets abducting people, that is absolutely something that every American should be afraid of. We should all be wanting that gone. So that's Trump. He needs to go. And Biden will be better than that. But he's not ideal for me, and his vice president won't be, and his cabinet won't be, and his like the person that he puts in charge of the Fed won't be. It'll be everything that we don't want. But that's where leftists have to stop it's like we got Obama into office, and it was a huge movement and moment, right, for us. Like I listened to this guy speak in Dallas. I'd never gone to a political event in my life. I was, 28 years old at the time, or 27 years old at the time, and I thought, man, this country is different. It's different right now. And I did not vote for him on his second term because he was still doing drone strikes like Bush was doing in the Middle East and killing little kids. And he was still imprisoning Muslims with no fucking access to our political system, no due process, so to me, it was like, yeah, we got some of the good stuff, but all of the stuff that I hated about Bush that I thought was an abuse of like our power on an international level, he agreed with all of that. He was fine with all of that. And so I wasn't fine with that. And I think that's another thing leftists do better than liberals or people on the right is we hold our elected people accountable. Like I didn't vote for Obama in the second term, because I just couldn't. I could not like morally go and drop my name and vote for him knowing that he didn't align with my principles, and that doesn't mean that you should not vote if everyone doesn't agree with you 100% holistically, but there should be things that are non-negotiable. And bombing kids in the Middle East and hospitals in the Middle East and creating, this instability in the Middle East so that you can control their money and their oil and believing that that's the U.S. right to do that. That is a non-negotiable for me. Like I cannot support that kind of shit,
No, I mean, every president has committed war crimes and should be tried. Like that's just how like it is. Obama is, he deported how many millions of Mexicans as well and Hispanics. Plus, like you said, he not only engaged in the same wars in the Middle East as Bush, but he expanded them as well. That's something that we forget about too. Similar to JFK, right? Like the imperialist U.S. monster did not wither from Eisenhower to JFK. It grew.
Yeah.
Which is,
if anything, it grew because Eisenhower was less of an imperialist. Eisenhower, you would almost say, was an isolationist, and he also hated the military-industrial complex. Like he wanted to sink the military-industrial complex. Like he was probably more progressive in that sense than like a JFK.
Absolutely.
A lot of liberals, the problem is they don't see that it's a problem how we bully international communities and how we use our power. They just think that they could do it better, or they could do it in a way that was like maybe,
And you know what? The reality is that comes from a even like in a weird way, like from Obama, like even in his case, right? It comes from a white supremacist ideology.
Yeah,
it comes from the sense that we have manifest destiny. We can wipe out and commit genocide against any Native American group. We can commit illegal wars against Mexico and Spain. It doesn't matter. We're going to expand this country. And guess what? We're going to enact the Monroe Doctrine. So all of you European empires, this is our land now. Central and South America, that's ours. That's our turf, not yours. Okay? So from the very onset, we have been a very hawkish, imperialist, white supremacist nation when it comes to our foreign policy. From the very onset of this country, we have enacted and partook in genocide. Yep. So fast forward 2020, we're still engaged in genocide in Yemen, right? Like the idea of the U.S. imperialist system has never faltered at all, and no president has really done anything to challenge that status quo. Eisenhower did in that rousing speech, in his last speech that he gave in office, but that's it. He didn't enact any policies to safeguard the American people from that military-industrial complex. He complained about it. Similar, a lot of, even though Eisenhower wasn't really a liberal, but even in part today's time, he would be deemed a liberal, let's be honest, right?
Yeah, him and Nixon would definitely be far left from the conservatives are now.
They would be like the Joe Bidens of the world,
Yeah,
in some aspect. It's a lot of rhetoric, right? It's a lot of lip service to us. It's not real policy. It's not real change. When we go from JFK to Lyndon B. Johnson to Nixon, the Vietnam War got worse and worse and worse. Like the rhetoric never changed. Yeah, we got the EPA with Nixon. Awesome. But you're still bombing and committing war crimes in Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia.
Yep.
It's, I feel like a lot of people, like you said at the very beginning, want to just put the blinders on, focus on the positive, ignore it, go back to work, right? Go back to normalcy. But the reality is that even the normal, that whatever you can envision, those out there listening, whatever normal time you envision, whatever year it was, whatever day it was in your life, we were partaking in imperialist war crimes, guaranteed. We were partaking in the exploitation of people and natural resources, not only within this country, but around the world. And those are just facts. That's just the public record, as James Baldwin would say, right? Like, that's just like, it's not up for debate. It's just the public record. I am very, very curious to see what happens moving forward. I'm going to play this clip because I did this. I put together a little bit of a reel of some of the protests, some clips from the protests they've been seeing. Some of these are going to be from Chicago. Some of these are going to be from Portland. I believe I had to take out due to time ones in Puerto Rico, ones in Israel, and some other ones around the country as well. So unfortunately, I had to do that. But let me play this clip. As you see, and as I think most people have been seeing for the last at least for the last few months, right? I forget how many months or days it's been. We've been seeing the rise of the fascist police state of America really attack the citizens of this country. And, there's an interesting piece from Dr. Patrick Wyman, great guy, and used to be a MMA reporter as well. So, us combat sports heads, we can get along. But a doctor in history, and specifically in the fall of the Roman empires, I think what he got what his dissertation was about, right? But he wrote an article about imperial armies always come home. And the idea that we, as a country, have sent off on the periphery of this empire, because we are an empire. The U.S. empire does exist. No scholar out there can argue against that. We have, at this point now, close to a century, you can argue, right? Close to a century of imperial dominance on this country. Even within the Cold War, we had imperial dominance within the world. We did. We had more nukes, more missiles, more bombers, more everything than the Soviet Union. Like, that's just, again, public record. So we've had a century now almost of imperial dominance, where our armies and forces and intelligence services have enacted widespread chaos, destruction, and mayhem across the globe. That was always going to come home to roost. That was always going to come back to us. And that's why you're seeing mercenary companies on the streets of Portland firing at protesters. That's why we're seeing certain tactics implemented by the DHS when it comes to abducting people, when it comes to hiding information. There's a lot to be worried here. Unfortunately, I will say there's a lot of legal loopholes to where it makes it very hard to fight against this, right? For example, in Portland, the feds can absolutely enact Customs and Protections, Customs and Borders and Protection Bureau, right? That organization, they can enforce them because Portland's within 100 miles of the coast. As you know, all federal forces cannot act within states without state authority unless it's immigration services and it's within 100 miles of the border. So that's how you get that. For example, in DC, why the feds were able to implement anyone they wanted into that sort of army that we saw from Barr. That's because Washington, D.C. is not a state, so it's not withholding of that regulation. And plus, it's probably within 100 miles of the coast anyways. Most people live within 100 miles of the coast or the border. So there's a lot of loopholes when it comes to that. For example, the naming and identification of federal officers that, they're hiding their names, they're not even putting names on, or any sort of institutional insignia. They can do that because at this point in time, there's no federal law stating that federal agents or officers have to have names or have to identify themselves to the public. There's no law on that, unfortunately. These are things we have to clean up. These are things we have to get rid of in terms of these loopholes, because obviously we have allowed the police state, both from a local and federal perspective, to grow, like you said, to a level that is absurd. And it's, again, very, very scary. Fu, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like you said, the loopholes are ridiculous. The fact that we have, the fact that I talk to teachers who have to go out of their own money to buy like school supplies for kids or like breakfast for children in their classroom because their parents can't afford it and the school doesn't get the budget, that's a problem. And then the larger issue is that you have this militarized police force where they have tanks that can roll out onto the streets because they've increased that budget so much, right? Or they have, sound machines that, we wouldn't even allow. Like, if China rolls that stuff out, we see video of China like blasting people with water, tanks and stuff. Every politician here would be like, oh my God, that's such an abuse. The people shouldn't be dealing with that. But in our own states, we'll say we can do it.
Let alone firing chemical weapons, which is a war crime.
War crime. But then when they were questioned about it, said there's nothing wrong with doing it to your own citizens. Meanwhile, we go around the world policing other leaderships for the same thing.
Who's going to police us?
And that's the issue. And that's where I think where you were talking about before, 100% like spot on, is that as the international community gets stronger, like that's been our fear. Like Brazil and all of these other countries are gaining international power, right? And we start to slowly lose international power. And as we do,
China.
We're going to have, China. We're going to have to bring a lot of our military home, right? And what's going to happen? Rich people like Jeff Bezos and these corporations are going to 100% fight for control of like the military to police citizens and police to become more abusive to citizens, because the ultimate goal will to be keeping the employee in line so that capital can continue to grow for these corporations and rich people. And that is the government's role in a capitalist society. As you know, capitalism could not exist without a central government and a central bank. Like, it would not. Every company would go out of business. There's no way without the no interest loans, the no bid contracts, government doing all the R&D for these companies, and then they take on all of that stuff that's been developed and they run with it and make money off of it, you know, and the internet, all of that, like all these companies that use B&F Railroad or whatever, Burlington Northern, right? They run that. And that was completely developed by the government and slave labor, by the way. But we don't want to talk about that. But I mean, you know, completely developed by the government. And like, you know, David Harvey will talk about, and like, the guy from the New School, what's his name? Richard Wolff will talk about.
Yes.
So always publicize the debt and privatize the profits, so that as taxpayers, we're paying back for all of that R&D, not only in our taxes to make sure that that research and development can be done so that private corporations can be super wealthy, but then also we pay an exorbitant amount of money for it when we have to use it or utilize it, you know? So like,
for example, Big Pharma is like the biggest example of that. Any sort of medicine that's been created that you can think of has been due to government subsidiaries, because without that, like you said, their funding would not work. The capitalistic system will not work. And it's funny because the capitalistic system is such a leech by design, right? Like that's what it is. It leeches off of the public, both from making you work and taking your product, taking your service that you provide and giving you pennies on the dollar for it. On top of that, like you said, on the back end, making you pay for all their stuff in terms of supplies. And it's this really nasty system that I think is just so obvious and evident. And speaking of
the American worker works the most hours, is the most productive in the world, and gets the least amount of time off, and generates the least percentage of what they produce and going into their own pocket. So, you know, it's like we are so exploited as workers, and that's like on a whole. And then when you break it down into like racial terms, it becomes even more sadistic. And then when you look at like, people think slavery ended, but let's face it, private prisons is just a slavery system. I mean,
the 13th Amendment, the second sentence in the 13th Amendment says, yeah, but you know, not private prisons, prisoners can definitely be forced labor.
Yeah.
Like, the second sentence says that in the 13th Amendment. The amendment that freed the slaves also said, yeah, but not really.
And then you know why they put that in there, because like as soon as slavery ended, they started private policing, and the people that were slave police basically like caught, you know, runaway slaves, everything became our police force, and we over policed black communities to put them in prison and then to use them for free labor. Like that's, I mean, our country and capitalism in general is 100% built on and has to be sustained by cheap or free labor. There is no way, because I was trying to explain to someone on Twitter, they talked about, well, if you raise minimum wage, then inflation. And I'm like, look, that's such a stupid argument, because inflation is a product of how much currency is in circulation. It is not about wages. Like if you understand monetarism, which started in like the late 70s, it's about supply and demand. You put more money into the economy in terms of the Fed printing it, right? Mm-hmm. It's going to devalue the dollar. That causes inflation. So you can easily give every worker $20 an hour, no problem, as a minimum wage. You just would also have to take from the top. You couldn't continue to grow that top 5% of the country at an exorbitant rate by printing a bunch of money to hand them, because then, yes, you would get inflation. But if you give to one and slow down the growth of the other, then inflation would be fine. And there's all these externalities that you'd have to talk about in terms of value of currency in Australia or China or whatever that also lead to inflation. or production of oil in Africa and in the Middle East. Like that contributes to inflation. So there's all these things that are externalities that like we just want to speak about inflation because people understand. They think, well, if I make $10, what would it matter if I made $20, but it cost me $5 for a gallon of milk? That's how that's a very simple way for a working person to go, I'll just keep making $10 an hour and feel bad about myself. Right. And so that's where, like, again, when you talk about the left and winning minds, like we have to be able to speak about these things in very true ways, you know, and in a way that like someone can understand and be like, no, absolutely, I want to get paid $20 an hour, and I want Jeff Bezos not to make $42 billion during a fucking pandemic.
Like, for example, when we talk about, there's two things I want to bring up. So I'm trying not to forget the second one, but the first thing I want to bring up is like bringing up, let's say, Medicare for all and that raising people's taxes. It's true. It will raise your taxes. Like, you can't argue against that. But you're also not going to pay your premiums anymore. Those go away completely. And on top of it, we're going to make the rich people pay a lion's share of the taxes. So even though maybe your taxes might go up a little bit, you're going to end up saving more money from not having to pay your premiums anymore for your private insurance. And on top of that, we're going to make these rich motherfuckers pay for this system to work.
Because it's percentage based. If it's 2.2% of your income, people need to understand if you make $40,000, you're going to pay less than $1,000 a year for healthcare that you don't have to pay for when you go to the hospital. You don't have to pay for when you get your medicine. You don't have to, like it's taken care of at that 2.2%. But also Jeff Bezos, who just made $42 billion or $46 billion, is going to pay 2.2% of his income into that system. So, like that's where people need to understand, like a normal worker. There was a time, Matt, when I was paying $10,000 a year for healthcare for my wife, my son, and myself to be on healthcare. It was $880 a month. So $9,000, a little over to like $10,000 a year. That's unsustainable. Like, how can a working family, if you make $45,000 and $10,000 of that immediately goes to healthcare, you're starting at $35,000, and then you're getting taxed on that about 22%, 26% sometimes, depending. So if you claim zero dependence, which a lot of people do, because a lot of people don't understand that you should not, at the end of the year, hope for a major income tax return. You should hope for like the smallest return possible because you don't want to give the government an interest-free loan. And that's all you're doing. If you get $1,000 back, you just overpaid taxes by $1,000 and they didn't give you any percentage increase on that $1,000. Get closer to zero and invest that shit. That's what you should do.
That's a good point. I also want to bring up, I saw someone say, not exactly your argument of like if you raise the minimum wage, inflation rises. I didn't see that argument. I saw the more simple one, which is a little more true. Of if you raise the minimum wage, the cost goes up, and that's true. But that's evidence that social movement does not exist in capitalism. Like the idea that if we paid people more in the lower class, then we would have to, unfortunately, raise costs for them too. So they never actually are able to move up the social ladder. So whenever people bring up this issue, it's actually evidence that capitalism is at fault. That capitalism is the issue. That capitalism is not sustainable, I think is the word you also use. That this thing is not sustainable.
Yeah, because what they're saying when they say that, like this is another issue with like Americans in general, right? Like one, we don't understand causation and correlation. Like we intermingle those consistently with arguments. And then the other thing is we don't understand like the full conclusion of what we're saying a lot of times, right? So like when someone says that particular thing, well, yeah, I might make more, but the cost of everything's going to go up. Well, it doesn't have to, but what you're saying is that the people who own this economy are going to factor in your cost to work for them to produce or whatever you do. Like we're mostly a service economy. So like if you're at McDonald's handing someone a bag of food, that they're going to say, hey, you get $20 an hour now. So it cost me a lot more to run this thing. So I'm going to raise how much a Big Mac cost, right? Like, so that's another defeatist mindset, because there's no reason for the cost of that Big Mac to go up. Because there was a time when people understood that there was a cost to doing business. And like, you know, when you really research like Adam Smith, which is a big thing for people on the right, they always talk Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith, blah, 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 but they never really get to the nitty gritty of what Adam Smith said. And a lot of Adam Smith stuff was like, the Wealth of Nations is not really what the nation has to give to the rest of the world. The wealth of the nation was the people in the nation. Like, that was his invisible hand, and the guidance would always lean to doing what's best for the citizens of your own country. Like, and that's where he thought, and he could never have seen this, right? But like, Portugal's wine was the biggest export at the time that, you know, he was writing that book. And there was no mobility of a corporation closing their doors and moving to China, you know, or moving to South Korea or something, right? So he never could have guessed that. He never thought people would be that, like, that labor would be that mobile, right? So in his mind, he's like, if you free this economy up, you liberate people, you give people, you know, classical liberalism, let them have their own land, their own houses, and own shit, right? He thought that's what's going to empower people, because ultimately that economy is going to work for the people that it services. But that's not true in our world, because of the fact that corporations are global and too mobile, right? So if you charge too much to work here, well, fuck it, we'll go to Bangladesh, we'll go to Thailand, we'll go wherever we can get cheaper labor.
And you know, you mentioned him earlier. Rest in peace to Michael Brooks, and you know, this show was created in large fashion because of him, right? And to honor him and to honor the legacy and the idea that, like, if you have a voice, like, now's the time to fucking use it, right? Like, that's why we did this show. His sense of internationalism was unmatched when it comes to the new left, right? And when you talk about, you know, capitalism and the evils of it being so mobile, right? That's basically what you're saying. Then when we talk about fixing American capitalism, that might be such a futile effort, in the same way that I view fixing the American political system before capitalism as a futile effort, because it's dealing with the symptom and not the issue. The issue is a international capitalistic system that exists, that exploits and extracts labor from the third world and takes it to the first world, right? That is that's the basis of the system that was founded on under colonialism, right? To defeat that would take an international movement, not a national movement. Like, we have to start, in terms of the left, in terms of socialists, in terms of Marxists, we have to really start connecting to each other internationally, and to start creating this movement more internationally. And to one highlight, or one silver lining, is that this recent run of protests and the BLM movement has been international. We've seen that. Like I said, I was going to play clips from Puerto Rico, which I know you say should be independent. I have maybe some different opinions about that. But, you know, Puerto Rico, for lack of a better term, is an international land, even though it's within the country's, U.S.'s jurisdiction in some fashion. Though for most people, they don't view it that way. You know, we have protests going on all over the world, in the UK, in Israel, which I was going to play a clip from. You know, this international movement that we're seeing needs to expand, and we need to be more connected to each other. And luckily, in today's time, we can be, right? Like, we live in such a interconnected international time that if these major corporations can get up and move, so should this movement. Like, if we at any point need to get up and start moving to Brazil, which is dealing with its own fascist dictator in Bolsonaro, or we need to get up and move to Israel and deal with the apartheid state there, like, there's a lot we need to discuss in terms of how we maneuver as a movement, how we strategize as a movement, because we need to start thinking more of an international perspective. We need to start thinking of how do we upend the capitalistic status quo, not only within our own country, but also around the world. Because if we fix our country, it does nothing. These corporations can get up and move. They'll go to China, which, even though it's a communist state, has opened up anything to capitalism. So it's, we get into this weird case and weird situation here where even if we were to, in theory, win here, whatever that would look like, right? It may still not be winning. We still may have an Amazon, a Microsoft, whatever company we're talking about, right? Comcast, and they just move international. They just go to a different country where they can still function from a tax perspective, and they can still work in the U.S. and they can get by, and they can still exploit labor, extract resources from the third world, and take it to the first world. So it's just something that I don't know solutions, but I see a clear issue. I think that we do need more of an international movement. I don't know what that looks like, but just something I've been thinking about.
Yeah, I think another thing, again, rest in peace, Michael Brooks, is such a great voice for the left and so unwilling to bend, but also such a nice guy to a lot of people that he maybe didn't agree with. I think that's something that maybe we're not always the best at on the left is giving space to people that we don't agree with. But one thing that I really appreciated about him was the spirituality piece that he talked about on the left and giving, all of that to the right, basically, to own, and I think, I'm not a religious person, but I'm definitely a spiritual person. Like when you talk about humanism and the, I agree that if you don't have to be close to someone that dies to notice, to realize as a human, the impact that that's going to have on the other people in their lives that love them. Right. So to me, that's what it's all about. The interconnectivity of the human spirit or soul or whatever you want to call it. But
yeah.
I am spiritual in that sense. And that's what's always really driven me to view the world from where I did. The bigger dinner table argument, right? Get more people at the table, I grew up on a ranch with 14 people, everyone lived with my grandparents, we did what we could and we had everyone was welcome. And I think that is where my socialism came from and my idea that you should take care of others and that the greatest thing that you can do in life is just be a good advocate for humanity. And if you want to see that as Jesus Christ, if you want to be religious, that's great. Whatever drives you to do the things that you need to do to make this experience, which oftentimes is fucking miserable,
yes,
better for people, you should do that. If it's sitting for an hour and getting totally zenned out and just getting away from everything and centering yourself, do that. And if it's creating a podcast, then do that. If it's sitting and reading a book or, listening to something in your car on the way to work that helps you get in the right mindset to deal with people and make those interactions better, people should do that, because those are the things that are going to go the furthest in transforming the world to be more like what we want. The more that people understand and care about each other, the easier those little those little changes that we need to make are going to be. Because I think that in a perfect world, people would be socialists. If people were really close with their neighbor or close with somebody, they would want their neighbor to have food and a home and clothing and a good a good life. Mm-hmm. They would want them to have dignity. And that's just a natural thing for people. I don't think you could talk to anyone who was a Trump supporter, but if you got them one-on-one and asked them should these things be something you would want your neighbor to have or somebody in your local community, if a lot of times I have to phrase it someone who works 40 hours a week, should they be able to afford food, a home, clothing, dignity? I've never had anyone say no. I've never one-on-one talked to someone who was no. Everyone says the same thing. Yeah, I mean, why wouldn't they? They're working their ass off, they're putting in their work, they should have dignity. Because that to us is so ingrained that we would not want to see someone suffer. That's why we try to get homeless people off the streets, because they don't want you to see that suffering, because then you might get a mind to go do something about it, right? Like, they try to distance you from every bad thing that capitalism produces, because if you saw it every day and you really thought about it every day, you would want something to change, right? And so it's just, to me, those are the things we can do as leftists. Like, we can be kinder to the normal person. We can still have our ideas, and we can still be adamant about like what we're not going to accept, right? And we can still have confrontational conversations with people, because you have to if you care.
And on top of that, I not to jump in, I think you're on a roll. I think for a vast, for the majority, I'll say that for the majority, what you're saying is absolutely applicable, and I echo it completely. But there's that 30%, whatever it is, that they might just be a little bit too far gone. And at this point, I do believe that to a degree. And those are the people that we have to battle. Like, those are the people that we are in a fight with. There are people in the middle that we have to win over. And when we talk about being empathetic to them, explaining things from a humanist perspective, because when you explain things as simple as should a man or a woman or a child ever live without dignity? Should they ever live without food, without clothing, without a home? Then most people will say, of course they should live with those things. But there is that subsection, that there is that group that they might even say they agree with that, but they don't. And that is a group to be worried of and wary of, and to understand that we are in perpetual battle with them, for lack of a better term. When we could talk about like true fascists, like, they will never see things from an empathetical side, and they are very, very clever about disguising their harshness.
And keep in mind, some of those people pretend to be on the left.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, Joe Biden recently was asked something about UBI, and he said that, hey, no, everyone should have a job. There's a lot more to a job than just a paycheck. And to me, there's nothing about a job bigger than the paycheck. Like, that's all you go to work for, to make money. And you're never, like, I say this as a 39-year-old man real quick, because this is a very important point for people to understand. The place that you work does not care about you above their bottom line and what they are trying to accomplish as a corporation or as a company. There's never going to be a point they would put you above themselves as a corporation or a company. And so for people to get emotional about their job in that way, or like to work for free, or to do multiple jobs and not get paid, never do that. That's part of the predatory capitalism part. And like, not talking about your paycheck with your other employees, you should definitely disclose what you make to other people, because it gives everyone else bargaining power. When you're giving up all of your power as an employee when you do those things. And so like, that's where like that sense of community and that camaraderie has to be there, or you can never take down these systems. Like, they'll continue to be predatory.
Yeah, because the end goal, in a sense, is that we own everything. Like, we own the means of production, right? We own these factories, right? That's the final goal, right? If you're the guy handing the bag of fries, right? The end goal is that you are the part owner of that McDonald's. That you all there working there have an ownership stake in that company. That's the end goal. So in order to get there, you need to think of yourselves, think of your coworkers as a unit, as a family, as a group that have intrinsic goals together. Because otherwise, if you view yourselves as competitors, as everyone's fighting for the bag, then you're never going to get to a point where you all own it. Like Richard Wolff often talks about how we've, in theory, even though there's a lot of argument against this now, and he will even say that we've democratized politics, right? Like, we have elections, we have a democracy in theory, right? we have yet to democratize the economy. We have yet to democratize the workforce. We still work from a hierarchical and, for lack of a better term, monarchy system, a monarchical system where there is one person or one group in control, and then we all work for them or subservient to them. And even like ideas of like rights, like our rights, and a lot of aspects are left at the door when we walk into a company, right? In terms of free speech and other certain rights we have, we don't keep them when we walk into a private corporation.
Yeah, you're supposed to have the right to unionize. And as soon as you mention unionizing at your job, you will be fired. If you do not have like union representation at the time, if you go to like 3 employees and say, we should start a union, they're going to find a way to move you out of that business really, really quick, because that's the least that they want. And there's issues with unions.
Yes.
But let me tell you, like, people who think unions are worse than what we have now, and like this right to work, yeah, which again, such a fucking good play on words, right to work.
Again, the right is, in terms of like conservatives and fascists, they are so clever that you have to be careful about them. Like, you know, you could be having a conversation with one and they can make it seem like they're the good guy, and they're not.
Yeah. Right to work just means that a company can fire you for no reason. You know, that is what it means. Like before, when there were unions, you could not get fired without your union rep being present and there being a course of action put in place for you to be let go. And then unions made it very hard for people to be let go. And unions also made it very hard for companies to take all the profits and run with them and not give them out to the worker. Because if you look, in the 80s, we were the highest paid workers in the world. And by 1992, we were like second from the bottom. Mm-hmm. And that was after all the union busting that happened for 22 years or so. Yeah. So, I mean, that's where I think, again, the left fails to understand. There's a lot of like righteous anger on the left, and it's there. It's not misplaced. It's valid, but it's like the Marxist thing. Like, there is no set defined goal. There's no place that we're clearly going to, right? And so we have to find that place that we're clearly going to. And it's empowering workers. It's empowering like people that do not have power, that have been disenfranchised, that voice has been stolen. It's in, there should never be private prisons in this country. That is a sick fucking model. There should never be private healthcare in this country. Again, sick fucking model, and so like those are the things that we need to really rally around, things that I think a lot of people, a majority of Americans, would 100% support you on. Like, you could say to anyone, like, should somebody die because they don't have healthcare? They're gonna say no, right? Like, no one's gonna be like, yeah, like, just let them die, they don't have healthcare. I mean, again, it's going to be maybe 20% of the population, the 80-20 rule. Like in cells, it's pretty much the same in like human behavior outside of cells. That 20%, though, is going to have a hard ass time saying that publicly, right? Because everyone's going to be like, you're a fucking psycho. You just think so much of it should die if they don't have health care? That's crazy. And so then you can build upon that argument and say, well, then why do we have a system that stops people from being able to access? And again, access is such a shit word, guys. Like, you have access to housing, access to healthcare, but you can't afford it, right? So you need to be able to afford it. It needs to be free. Like, it needs to, not free in the sense of like free at the point of service, but you're paying for it in a tax. Like, that's the thing. Like, we need to get better at communicating our message, because then they say, oh, well, leftists want everything for free. No, I want to work because I am able to work. I want people who are not able to work or do other things in their life. If you want to be a content creator, then I think as an artist, you should be able to do that. If you want to paint and create beauty, you should be able to do that. But in our system, that does not exist because you cannot sustain yourself on it, right? So I want all of those things for people, and I want to have dignity when I do those things. Like, that's the big thing. Leftists don't want handouts. We want people to have value, even in things that we maybe do not value right now, like musicians and art and people just spreading knowledge, like on YouTube content and
teachers,
right? Teachers, moms and dads, things like that. Like, people have value even if they're not producing an hourly wage at a job. Like, and we have to figure out how to communicate these things and how to take back that space where the left is just about empowering the majority of people against the juggernaut that is corporatism and the central government being a bank for corporatism, right? Because they should be a bank for the people because it's our money.
Yeah, it's our government.
Right? Exactly.
It's for us, by us, right? Like it should be us.
Yep.
But then we get into maybe the weeds of like a representative government and it not being a true democracy, and we live in a republic, and that having some issues.
Yeah.
But speaking of privatization, just want to sort of run through these topics so we can get out of it because we've been on for an hour and a half. Not that we're going to be on this long, but us.
I kind of figured we would be. But
oh God, so good. Quickly, the U.S. Postal Service are very concerned in terms of their workers and such of the Postal Service being privatized soon. A bunch of policies have been in place. This is a good article from The Intercept if you want to go check it out. And this is a real simple topic in my opinion, but I'm going to try to do my best to explain it. The U.S. Postal Service, as a service that the government provides, usually is actually very profitable. I will say that. I think people forget about that. Most social services actually are quite profitable, and we forget that. But they're not designed to be profit-driven, because if they were, they would not be able to deliver a letter or a piece of mail to any house, any place, any address in the United States. FedEx doesn't do that. Right? Like, name any private corporation in terms of mailing service. They don't deliver to every single location because it's not profitable. So the idea of the Postal Service as an institution was to bind the people to where anyone can communicate with anyone in this country via mail, because obviously that was for a long period of time the prime motive of communication. And even to this day, it's still a prime motive of delivering of information, I should say, right? Like when it comes to government information, government bills, I still get a lot of bills through the mail, not through online. Like there's a purpose for it. If I lived in Timbuktu, I should be able to get mail. I should be able to get whatever is being sent to me. And often we create services like the Postal Service to run at a loss at times, even if it runs at a loss, because we know it's more important to, from a human perspective, bind this country together through the Postal Service. Fu, thoughts on the USPS being slowly privatized before our eyes? We as leftists, and talking about saying the warning signs are here before everyone else. We've been saying this has been happening for a long time, that Postal Service is in danger, Social Security is in danger. Like, we've been saying this for decades now, it feels like.
Yeah, I mean, so the big thing about it is, like, they wouldn't try to privatize it if it wasn't profitable, right? Like, there's no one that's going to try to privatize a business that's going to lose them money. So the post office is definitely profitable. Another thing that's very important here that a lot of people miss is the fact that the post office is held to a different standard on pension plans. Mm-hmm. Like most companies, like a 401k or like the pension plans are not like necessarily required to be on hand. So the post office, I think they have to have something like 80% of the pension has to be paid for so many years in advance, so that it makes the post office look less profitable to the public. It makes it look like they're operating at a loss, whereas like if they were held to the same standard as other companies with pensions, they would be operating at a major profitable margin, right? Like they would be way more profitable than they are. So this has just been, I think, this has been a long-term plan for conservatives, because, and probably some people on the Democratic Party as well, because there's down the line, there's going to be somebody who's going to own that post office, the entire USPS, right? Mm-hmm. Someone's going to get it for some cheap ass, like probably wild contract, like they did when Bear Stearns went out of business or whatever. They'll sell it to someone for pennies on the dollar, and then that person becomes massively rich, and then we all talk about how hard of a worker they were to make all this money that they have now. It's a complete scam. Like, and we should not let it happen, because anything that creates equality, like the USPS, like, I mean, you have a system there that, one, has put people into the middle class, like through their pension plans and through their work and their efforts, right? And so you're taking that away, because when you privatize it, that all that shit's going away. It's going to be some predatory, like 401k system where you're just giving a 401k management company a shitload of money to manage like the retirement of a hell of a lot of employees, And then the other side of that is, then again, they're going to institute policies where they don't deliver mail to certain people, because it's not profitable. There's a reason that your local Domino's only delivers so far from that location, because it's not, they would have to charge too much to deliver, or deliver for less than they want to, and it's not profitable. So it's like, you would either have to start paying to have your mail delivered to your house if you live in an area that's maybe outside of city limits or something, or outside of the zone they deliver to. And then that creates an issue to where, again, you're dealing with some form of inequality to the rural community versus like the inner city community, or the actual like established like city limit community, and there's already so much inequality there when it comes to like internet ability, TV coverage, phone coverage, things like that on the rural community, that now you're going to separate them that way.
Things that should be public utilities too.
Like, yeah, exactly.
Like the internet should be a public utility, but it's not. And that's why you have issues in rural areas when it comes to internet connection. Absolutely. And you're going to have that same issue when it comes to the mail. If the USPS gets privatized, it's not even that. Even like libertarian, like juice heads, like Joe Rogan, will be like, no, the USPS is good.
Yeah.
Like it. I hope to God this is one of those things where it's because most people seem to be in favor of the USPS. It won't actually happen. But it's clear that there's been an establishment movement to privatize the USPS for some time.
Yeah.
So
it'll be just like public utilities, right? In Texas, they went through this whole thing, and again, another beautiful display of like language, control. They said freedom of choice was the electric thing, right? Like we want to give you freedom of choice. We don't want you to have to buy from the state. We want you to be able to buy from a private corporation that is buying from the state. So what happened is you got electric from, one of these like 30 new electric providers that popped up. But what did they do? They had to buy it from a grid that was owned by the state. So that charge went in addition to what you were already paying for electricity. So your electricity went up, so it's like, we really have to be aware of like, Eugene Debs said it the best, right? Is that like fascism is going to come to you cloaked in an American flag and talking about freedom and liberty and all of the things that you want to hear about, right? Because that is the way people operate. They understand what triggers the right response in your brain, and the left has to get better at like controlling the narrative and the language to get people to buy onto those programs.
I forgot this person's name. I want to say it might be British. He has like white hair.
Bertrand Russell?
No. Maybe like Indian descent. It's like Aman. Its last name starts with a G. I forget his name. But I remember he was on MSNBC once, and he was talking about how we need to take back the word like patriotism. Like it is patriotic that we want Medicare for everyone.
Yep.
That is patriotic. Like we have to take back the idea of like what's liberty, what's freedom, like the words that have become the iconography, so to speak, of America need to be taken back by the left.
Yeah, and we need to make better arguments for Medicare for all. Like, you're not free when your health care is tied to your employment. You're not, because you can't leave. I have a 6-year-old son. So if I leave my job, I have no medical coverage for up to 90 days. Some places even worse, if they make you wait until the next enrollment period, you could go longer. And so, like, what am I supposed to do? Leave my job and lose all my medical benefits for 90 days? What if my son gets in an accident in those 90 days? Now I go bankrupt? Or, oh, you can get the COBRA, the gap, to cover the gap, but then COBRA is like 3 times what you pay for your health care, you know? And so it's like, there is no freedom in that. And that's why it's attached to your employment, because it gives employers power over the employee. Because as soon as you remove those things from employment, like in Australia, your retirement's not attached to your company. Your retirement is a tax you pay to the state, and it's held and invested for you, and you get it from the state at the end of your employment. So again, if you remove those things from employers, you remove their power. So a large corporation has no bigger advantage than a smaller, locally owned business on employment. And that's freedom. Because then you could choose where you wanted to work versus being pigeonholed to go somewhere because of the benefits. And going to work somewhere that disagrees with maybe you politically or ideologically, or goes against your values because you need to take care of your family. The true freedom comes in removing those things from employment.
Well, you know, plus like the George Carlin bit, right? Where it's like we have 2 parties, but they're the same party. You know, you vote every year for the same person, right? You have this like this myth of choice, and then you get 26 different options of soda. You know, like that's your choice, right? That's your freedom, America, right? And even those 26 different, you know, flavors of soda, right? They're owned by 3 corporations.
Yep.
And that's it. Like even like your semblance of choice at like the grocery store, right, isn't really there. They're all massive corporations that own all these different subsidiaries, and that's what you see in these different brands.
Yep.
You know, it's like when you go to Apple Store and see Belkin. It's like Belkin's not a separate company; it's the subsidiary of Apple. Like you have this semblance of choice, but it's not really there.
Well, it's like a few years ago, B Corps were taken off, right? Beneficial corporations. There were corporations that required that the CEO didn't get paid X amount more than what a regular employee made. Employees had to have ownership, and they had to benefit the communities they were operating in, right? Well, what happened? As soon as they took off, they were like Method brand soaps and things like that. That was a B corporation. There were a bunch of other ones. I was really into them. I was buying them all the time, and then large corporations went and bought them up. And they bought them up. They kept the B Corp title, but they were a subsidiary of some fucking, just absolutely massive, awful corporation. And they were using it to kind of like whitewash all the things they were doing on the other side of everything and trying to make themselves look like great corporations instead of like the fact that they were just vampiric fucking awful corporations that were sucking the life out of America, So, I mean, again, it's like you said, like we can get to some wins, but are they really wins in the end? And if we don't do something about the massive amounts of capital that these corporations have and the power they have over our politics and the power they have over your everyday life, and we don't like break that. And that's what, like, getting back to James Baldwin real quick, that's what the Black movement knew in the 60s. Like I have been studying this so much since this COVID stuff, like just watching videos and watching these speeches by Lorraine Hansberry and James Baldwin and Fred Hampton and all these guys. And they all knew that the enemy was capitalism. And that is why, like, I think if you really put it into perspective, and I would love to hear from listeners, and I would love to hear from people that follow us on Twitter. And if you listen to this show, definitely message me on this. But I think that's why the Black community has been seen as like an enemy of America, because they have always largely been an enemy of capitalism. They've always spoken out about
I want to rephrase what you said, because you're on the right path. I want to rephrase just in terms of, saying the right stuff, right? Black people have always been the instrument of capitalism.
Yeah.
They have been the instrument in which we have seen the capital growth over the last 200, if not 400 years under international colonialism. But in terms of U.S. politics and the U.S. country, we've seen obviously slave labor, and then afterwards cheap wage labor, which is just one slide away from slavery, in my opinion. We've seen that be used, and we've seen them, as speaking of Black people, be used as the instrument to build the wealth that we see in the white community, the generational wealth that we see. And like you said, the Black revolutionaries of the 50s and the 70s and the 80s, all the way through, right? They were so pinpoint exact on the culprit of their issues, which was the capitalistic racist system, right? And those two being very intertwined. There's a large argument that a good argument that we don't get the rise of capitalism like we see unless we have the inherent racism in the slave trade that we have, that almost coincides with the Enclosure Acts in England. And I think that, like you said, the establishment, the racist capitalistic system does view Black people as the enemy, because they have now turned into that. They are now not only an instrument to be used and to be exploited, but they have now become sort of self-realized, right? Like they have now become self-aware of their own plight, of their own existence over the last 100, 200 years, right? And because of that, you can easily say that Black people, especially within America, have been the driving force of revolutionary thought.
Yep.
So of course they're going to be the enemy. Of course you have the Times, right? Shout out to the Times, reporting just briefly before James Baldwin died that he was a thing of the past, of the ghost of the 60s. They said that. The Times called him the ghost of the 60s.
He had 2 strikes against him too, though, because he was gay. In addition to being anti-capitalist, in addition to being anti-religious, right? So like he had 3 strikes really in our country, right? He was against the church, against capitalism, and he was against like the, foundational thought of like men and women being the only people who could have like sexual and emotional relationships, right? So there was a lot that James Baldwin was fighting.
Yeah, I mean, he was ahead of the gay movement. I mean, far ahead of it. I mean, he wrote books in the 50s that predate the gay liberation movement in terms of like it really gaining steam in the 70s. So it's James Baldwin is. We're gonna play some more clips later on. I want to briefly mention this, and then we can pull ahead to those clips. The HEALS Act is going to be voted on next week. I forget the exact date. I think it's like August 10th. I think is when it's going to get voted on by the House and then the Senate. Now, some key things here. One, it does look at this point in time that the money, the stimulus given to everyday people like me and you will be bigger than last time. However, that is clearly the carrot being dangled on the stick, because within this, they're also adding corporate immunity, which will allow schools, universities, and obviously corporations to be immune from any sort of lawsuits concerning COVID. This would be a huge shield from corporations when it comes to procedures, when it comes to protecting workers, when it comes to schools, protecting students. So definitely keep an eye out for this, and definitely keep an eye out for how corporate media, how cable news is discussing this, because if they're only talking about how we're going to get more money, then that's because they don't want you to realize what corporate immunity is. So just want
and again, if you're listening to this, what that means to you is, whereas like if you work for a major corporation right now, they're providing you with masks. They're providing the customer with masks. Like they're setting down downtime to clean the store, to clean up, to make sure that you're safe. All that goes away because they're no longer liable if you get sick. So now it's, you better go buy your own mask. And then, hey, if you have to work 3 hours extra and not get paid for it to make sure your workspace is clean and all that, that's just on you, because it's, again, we're not responsible for you getting sick. And so you've really got to pay attention to the fact that, like, this is going to transfer the cost of doing business in an environment where people need to be kept safe from being a responsibility of the employer to becoming a responsibility of the employee. And you're going to lose money in this. So it's not just about being able to sue your business if they get you into an environment where you are unsafe. It's also about, you're going to become responsible for cleaning, like the hours to clean the materials you need to stay safe, all of that. And it's a fucked up ordeal. And it really, if that part is the only way we get the money, I really feel bad for like the AOCs and Ilhan Omar's and these guys that are going to have to vote for it, because they're going to have to get the money to people, because we can't have, 40-something% of the U.S. go homeless. So it's really a shitty spot.
We'll add that the $600 unemployment benefit, the weekly benefit, that has obviously expired. That will be up for debate as well in this coming week.
And they're offering a counter as $100 instead of $600.
Yeah, I think that was the last thing I saw.
Miserable.
And we have Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi leading the charge.
They're just Republicans. I mean,
so bad.
Let's be real. Like, those two people are worthless.
Did you see that Chuck Schumer came out and had bipartisan? He was in bipartisan support with Trump in banning TikTok because of the Chinese tech company.
I don't even nothing surprises me about those people. Like Schumer and Pelosi are so close to a Republican that I don't even see a difference anymore.
I don't either. But think about this: we have bipartisan support to ban TikTok before we get defunding federal police, before we get let alone benefits for people, protections for the 40 million people that lost their job due to COVID.
Such a distraction. Meanwhile, Google operates with complete immunity, but collects all this data on us and gives it straight to the FBI.
NSA and CIA.
And the NSA and CIA and the US government. It's the largest data collection platform in the US and is completely used to spy on the American people and give all of your information. But people are like, yeah, let's get rid of TikTok because that makes kids happy and they do dances on there.
No, it's not because it's China.
No, I understand.
Oh, okay.
I understand. But I'm saying they can sell it to parents because they're going to say, we want to get rid of TikTok because of...
No. They're not selling it to parents. He's selling it to his base.
No, I understand, but his base hates any of that stuff because they see it as predatory to children. They try to keep their kids off of it. It's a distraction. It's like video games. It's
that's not the rhetoric he's using though. The rhetoric he's using is only China, and it's because he has supporters on TikTok. I mean, have you not seen I forget the name of them, but those MAGA girls that do the videos?
No, I don't.
Oh my God.
It's probably terrible. The right's terrible at memes. The right's terrible at being funny. There's a reason there's no really funny comics that are right-leaning. Dennis Miller became unfunny the day he started getting too political because he's such a fucking weirdo when it comes to politics.
Right-wing politics is not funny or enlightening.
No.
That's George Carlin can rant about politics because it's enlightening stuff.
Yeah. Bill Hicks could go crazy about politics because it was enlightening stuff.
Yes.
Hicks.
RP.
The right really only has
the gender joke about people switching genders. That's the main joke they have.
But they also only have really hateful people that there's two groups right now, I guess. There's the super hateful people, which I would say are the main steam behind the right. And then there are the working class people who do feel like they've been left behind and somehow the right's going to help them, which the right's never helped them. I mean, we can shit on liberals and Democrats all we want, but realistically, Bill Clinton was the last time the minimum wage was ever raised, something good was done there. And so, I don't know. The right is is miserable.
Shout out to them. Let's play a few James Baldwin clips and then head out of here because we've been on for a while. And I will recommend checking out this article from the Jacobin magazine. The Radical James Baldwin's the name of the article. It's a good in-depth piece about his history and everything, and it's goes into aspects of his affiliations with people like MLK, Malcolm X, and how much his friendship with Malcolm X or his dislike for Eldridge Cleaver because Eldridge Cleaver was homophobic. I mean, it's actually a very good in-depth piece and gives you some stuff that maybe you don't know. One
last thing before you play the clips, just real quick. Anyone with Amazon Prime should go watch I'm Not Your Negro. It's the James Baldwin documentary. It's very good. Also on Amazon Prime, I think they have the Black Panthers documentary on there now, which goes into a lot of the Fred Hampton stuff. And another thing people need to look at is the moments that major leaders in the Black movement and the civil rights movement, when they were killed, a lot of times it was because they were trying to unite white working class people with the Black movement, and that the government has always seen that as an issue. And if that coordination could ever happen, which I think we are seeing a lot of that in this new Black Lives Matter movement that we've got going on right now, that's where the true power is going to come from. The government's always known that, and the biggest fear is that working class white people and Black people will set aside those differences, whatever there's been for so long, and unite against the government and unite against capitalism and take that system down. So really, when you see the connectivity, the connection between MLK trying to unite people around poverty and the anti-capitalist movement, and Malcolm was always about Black-owned businesses and getting ownership of the Black community to Black people, and the Black Panthers the same thing, feeding underprivileged Black people, under served Black people. When you really dig into all of that, you see where the true power is, and the true power is that we all unite against capitalism. If you're a working class person and you get in the streets and you fight your government non-violently, hell, maybe violently at some point, hopefully non-violently, because I think that works best and quickest. But just real quick, wanted to say a couple of things there, but dig in. There's a lot there to know.
I agree. Quick disclaimer on some language, I guess, because it's language that, me and Fu can't use, that some language that James Baldwin used. So I just want to give a disclaimer on that. But obviously, James Baldwin's a legend, and his clips deserve to be played regardless of the language he uses.
Yeah.
Let's play the second one. The one I think that you were referring to very early in the show.
If we were white, if we were Irish, if we were Jewish, if we were Poles, if we had, in fact, in your mind, a frame of reference, our heroes would be your heroes too. Nat Turner would be a hero for you instead of a threat. Malcolm X might still be alive. And everyone is very proud of brave little Israel, a state against which I have nothing. I don't want to be misinterpreted. I'm not an anti-Semite. But when the Israelis pick up guns, or the Poles, or the Irish, or any white man in the world says, "Give me liberty or give me death," the entire white world applauds. When a Black man says exactly the same thing, word for word, he is judged a criminal and treated like one, and everything possible is done to make an example of this bad nigger so there won't be any more like him. I can't be a pessimist because I'm alive. To be a pessimist means that you have agreed that human life is an academic matter. So I'm forced to be an optimist. I'm forced to believe that we can survive whatever we must survive. But the Negro in this country, the future of the Negro in this country is precisely as bright or as dark as the future of the country. It is entirely up to the American people and our representatives. It is entirely up to the American people whether or not they're going to face and deal with and embrace this stranger whom they maligned so long. What white people have to do is try to find out in their own hearts why it was necessary to have a nigger in the first place. Because I'm not a nigger. I'm a man. But if you think I'm a nigger, it means you need it. The question you've got to ask yourself, the white population of this country has got to ask itself, North and South, because it's one country, and for a Negro, there is no difference in the North and the South. There's just a difference in the way they castrate you. But the fact of the castration is the American fact. If I'm not the nigger here, and you invented him, you, the white people, invented him, then you got to find out why. It is a terrible thing for an entire people to surrender to the notion that 1/9 of its population is beneath them. And until the moment comes when we, the American people, are able to accept the fact that I have to accept, for example, that my ancestors are both white and black, that on that continent we are trying to forge a new identity for which we need each other, and that I am not a ward of America. I am not an object of missionary charity. I am one of the people who built the country. Until this moment, there is scarcely any hope for the American dream, because the people who are denied participation in it, by their very presence, will wreck it. And if that happens, it's a very grave moment for the West. Thank you. What is it you wanted me to reconcile myself to? I was born here almost 60 years ago. I'm not going to live another 60 years. You always told me it takes time. It has taken my father's time, my mother's time, my uncle's time, my brother's and my sister's time, my nieces and my nephew's time. How much time do you want for your progress?
That's it, guys, for the show. Again, rest in power to James Baldwin, and rest in power to Michael Brooks, who passed away recently. Again, the left has lost a lot of legends far too early. Fu, final thoughts, man? Time to wrap it up.
I really enjoyed doing the show. I think it's important at this point in what will be our history that we step up and do these things, because it's important. You have a son. I have a son. We have listeners who have children. I want to ensure that my son is not fighting the same battles that we are having to fight because our parents didn't fight them and their parents before them didn't fight them. We have to confront the reality that we have not made right on the injustices that people have been subjected to in this country. And I think, there's no better time than now to really get this out there and do our best to deal with it. And so that in, 40 years, when my son is talking to his friends, they're not even aware of the same things that we're going through,
It'd be amazing if, let's say, freshman year of high school for my son, right? For your son, who are the same age, right? The same age. They maybe just be half a year apart. It'd be amazing if by that time we can say that we got rid of racial inequality and wealth inequality. Imagine what the world would look like if we got rid of those two things.
Yep.
Everything would change. Everything. And that optimism has to be there. That's not a pessimistic view of imagine if we get there. No, we're going to get there. It's going to happen. This movement, this shift to either reform or revolution is going to continue.
Yeah.
And we're going to get either or. It's the status quo is not going to exist anymore. What the new future, what the new paradigm looks like, I have no idea, but I know it's going to be different than what we see today. Absolutely.
Yep.
Find Fugate at Fugate MCR, all social media platforms. Find me at Mount Hunter MCR, all social media platforms. Hit the like button, share the show, subscribe, all that fun stuff, guys. Have a great day. Stay safe out there. Again, fuck the police, fuck 12, ACAB, abolish capitalism, abolish ICE, abolish the DHS. What else do we abolish? Fu, want to remind me anything else we need to abolish?
Man, all the bases in other countries.
Oh, U.S. imperialism.
bring all our boys and girls home, and let them be with their families, and let's stop being the world police, and
abolish apartheid in Israel.
Yeah, man, free Palestine for sure. Like, yeah, a lot of people don't understand how bad that whole thing is, but
Baldwin. Think about it. That interview was in the 70s. I want to say that was after MLK and Malcolm died, I believe. So that was at least 69, 70. Yeah, he had talked about how Israel is an apartheid state. He didn't mention it explicitly, but he alluded to it. And I know he talked about it in many other instances, and he wrote books about it as well towards the end of his life.
And here's another thing, guys, is there's a lot of misinformation about Israel's right to statehood. There's a lot of misinformation about how that whole thing progressed. And if you want to know a good timeline and watch good debates on that, Noam Chomsky will 100% give you every detail of everything that happened from as early as I think it's in the 30s. He starts talking about Israeli statehood and the plight of Palestinians and how the whole world turned on Palestine and allowed Israel to just do terrible things to those people.
And still do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Maybe we're going to talk about that as a more of a broader, specific topic on another show. Be back next week, guys. Maybe make this like a Sunday thing. I know you don't have work on Sunday, I'm assuming.
Sundays are always good. Yeah.
Yeah, let's make it a Sunday thing. So every Sunday, live here, guys. Enjoy. Have a safe day. Stay safe out there in the streets. And like Fu said, man, now's the time to speak up. Make your voices heard. March. Direct action is needed as well. One of those clips from the protests was of a protest at San Quentin prison, calling for the mass releases of prisoners there. That's direct action. We need more of that. Have a great day, guys. Peace.